Hey everybody, welcome back to All Fiction is Fantasy. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today on the channel, we're going to be doing something a little different because we're going to be taking a look at some non-fiction. So maybe some books that actually aren't fantasy. For people who watched the Dungeon Dive and watched my short-lived podcast series called the Dungeon Dive Hobbycast, you will know that I am a huge fan of Asian cinema. One of the series I did on that was, I think, a 5-part series where I took a look at all of the covers for all of my Asian, Hong Kong, and Japanese DVDs and Blu-rays, and just kind of did a brief synopsis on each one. And my favorite Hong Kong director and one of my favorite directors of all time is Tsui Hark. And I have a small collection of books that focus on Tsui Hark's work. So I wanted to feature those on the channel because I think these are really, really cool. It is neat to feel like books are specifically and tailor-made for you, the reader. And I feel like this little collection of books is like specifically made for me. It's such a niche hobby and a niche hobby and a niche hobby that it's kind of miraculous that these books even exist for me to enjoy. But let's take a look at this book first, because this is actually my favorite book that I own. And this is called The Swordsman and His Gong Wu. Now, Jiang or Gong Wu, as it's probably pronounced in my bad Chinese pronunciation, that literally translates into lakes and rivers. But what it is used for in this context is a world of an underbelly. It's used in cinema and in pop culture as the world of the martial artist. In a lot of Hong Kong cinema, you will have an underworld of criminal activity or an underworld of martial artists, and that is their martial world. And in this world, you might have characters such as, one-armed swordsmen or people who can use flying guillotines as weapons. And in their day-to-day life, they might be in disguise. So walking around the city, you might have women disguised as men, or men disguised as women, or androgynous heroes working at tea shops. You might have butchers who are actually kung fu experts, and they're in disguise. But these heroes can recognize each other, and they will often give each other looks of recognition as they pass by each other in the street. And so this book about Tsui Hark and his films is called The Swordsman and His Gong Wu for a certain reason. For one, The Swordsman is a very popular movie that Tsui Hark helped to create, and it is all about this kind of underworld, this secret organization of Hong Kong filmmakers. So this book was published by the Hong Kong Film Archive, and it is a collection of scholarly essays and interviews all about Tsui Hark. And this book is really rare. I looked today just to see how much it was going for, and I couldn't even find a single copy for sale, even on eBay or on Abe Books. And I rarely see this book for sale, and I absolutely love this book. It is written in Chinese and in English, so every single article is presented in both languages. But you just get a really cool look into a filmmaker that is pretty unknown outside of Hong Kong and outside of China. Tsui Hark was an interesting film director. He started up in the Hong Kong New Wave, making very subversive films, very political films. A lot of his films were very anti-China. He always had enemies. The evil would be kind of presented as big red flags, and he did a lot of politically motivated genre cinema. Unfortunately, after the handover of Hong Kong back to China, he has kind of tempered his political leanings, and I think that's too bad. I was really expected him to flee Hong Kong after the 1997 handover and maybe come to America or go to another country to continue his film career. but that didn't happen. And now he's kind of making some real nationalistic style films. But he's still a very interesting filmmaker. And in America, the 80s aesthetic of popular genre cinema kind of belonged to and was largely defined by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. Well, you could say the same thing for Hong Kong cinema in the 90s about Tsui Hark. Tsui Hark was instrumental in defining the kind of high flying, wire assisted, special effects heavy kung fu cinema of the 90s decade. And this is a book all about how he did that through the various companies he worked with, through the various directors he worked with, and the actors. He was a producer on many, many dozens of films, and he was actually a very hands-on producer, where kind of like think about how Steven Spielberg produced Poltergeist, but it was directed by Tobe Hooper, but it totally feels like a Steven Spielberg movie. A lot of the movies that Tsui Hark produced, he was a hands-on producer, kind of more of a co-director than a normal producer. But he made all kinds of really cool movies. And if you go to this color section here, it's kind of a timeline of the movies that he made. So in the 1980s, we have this kung fu cannibal comedy called We're Going to Eat You. His first movie was a kung fu mystery called The Butterfly Murders. And then Dangerous Encounters, First Kind, was also in 1980, a very, very subversive and politically charged film. And then one of the first big kind of effects crazy spectacle kung fu movies in 1983, we have Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain. Here we have some of his other movies. 1987 was a pivotal year with A Chinese Ghost Story and his work with Ching Siu-dong. 1987, A Better Tomorrow. He started working with John Woo, and he produced all of John Woo's big movies, The Killer, A Better Tomorrow. I believe he produced Hard Boiled. I can't remember exactly. And here we have The Swordsman. So 1990 really kicked off the decade of Tsui Hark with The Swordsman. He brought back King Hu, a very famous director, and he and King Hu had kind of a falling out on the set of The Swordsman. So I believe it's kind of recognized that Tsui Hark ended up directing most of The Swordsman. But we also have A Chinese Ghost Story 2 and 3. And then, of course, Big Trouble in Little China in 1991, which really kicked off the 1990s, the Wuxian, the Flying Swordsman style movie. We have The Wicked City there. Swordsman 3, The East is Red, and Swordsman 2, actually Swordsman 2 was on 1992 there. Dragon Inn, the remake of the Shaw Brothers classic there. The Magic Crane that he did with Ching Siu-dong. We have Green Snake, an absolutely beautiful film. One of my favorite movies of all time. Green Snake, super good. Chinese, Once Upon a Time in China 5, the only one to not star Jet Li. I believe that ended up starring Vincent Zhao. The Blade is another one of my all-time favorite movies, which is kind of a very poetic, kind of almost abstract remake of the One-Armed Swordsman, the Shaw Brothers classic there. Black Mask with Jet Li, and then he did A Chinese Ghost Story animation. He did 2 movies that were poorly received in the US, Double Team and Knockoff. I actually like both of those movies quite a bit. And then this only goes up to about 2001 or so, or 2001 with his new Legend of Zoo. And he has made quite a few movies after that, but I don't think any of them have been fantastic. A couple of them have been okay. It's so me. Very few books that I own, I can say were just kind of specifically made for something that I am into. And I just think that's really cool. And then we also have, this was the first book that was ever written that was focused solely on Tsui Hark. And this was by Lisa Morton. Lisa Morton has an interesting career. She's a writer of horror fiction. She's won a couple Bram Stoker awards. She also has worked on films like Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and she has written books on film and written screenplays. but this is a collection, a detailed analysis of all of his films up through, I believe, let's see. What's the last major film? The last major film that this goes through is Knockoff. So that was around 98 or so. So Knockoff was his movie that he made in the US, of course, with Jean-Claude Van Damme. And it actually takes place right at the handover of Hong Kong from the British back to Chinese control. And I think Knockoff is a really interesting movie. It's very subversive, and it has more to say than a lot of people think it has to say. But this movie just goes through, or this book goes through a brief biography of Tsui Hark, and then it goes through all of his, a really detailed analysis of all of his major movies. And then it also does an analysis of some of his other movies and the just plethora of movies that he produced and helped bring to light. So again, a really cool book there. And then we have these 3 books from the Hong Kong, the new Hong Kong cinema from the Hong Kong University Press. We have an incredibly detailed analysis of one of his best, Peking Opera Blues. Again, a very, very politically charged movie. This is a fantastic book all about Peking Opera Blues. And then we have a book about Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain. Again, the book that, or the movie that kind of set the standard in the early 80s for these kind of high-flying swordsman movies. And it did a lot with special effects. And just a really, really fantastic movie. We'll underline, it's kind of like getting a, I don't know, it's kind of like getting a relic from the past, because I bought this book used because I could not find it new. And it's actually pretty hard to find. But it's interesting to see that somebody went through and underlined things and what they found interesting. So I don't really mind that. And then tangentially, of course, is The Killer, because Tsui Hark was great friends with John Woo, and well, I don't know if friends is the right word. They were great. They were working contemporaries. I don't know if they were friends or not. I'm sure they probably butted heads a lot on camera or on stage, because a lot of people butted heads with Tsui Hark because he was so controlling. He wanted his movies to have a certain look and a certain feel. Even movies made by other great directors, he wanted them to feel like a Tsui Hark movie. But The Killer is a classic of heroic bloodshed, and this is another really great, very detailed analysis of that movie. But yeah, I just wanted to show some of these. I do have quite a few film books that we will be taking a look of. Film is another one of my great passions, especially world cinema, especially cinema from Hong Kong, and especially Hong Kong cinema of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm a huge fan of that kind of stuff. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoy taking this look at some nonfiction, and not all nonfiction. No nonfiction is fantasy, at least good nonfiction. I don't know what I'm trying to say. All I'm trying to say is I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.